The critical metaphysicians beneath the unemployed persons movement. From Tiqqun number 1. It's well understood there is no unemployed persons movement. The good fortune that this phrase hit immediately within a certain spectacular leftism, where it had already been a figure of historical reference, demonstrates that sufficiently, since nothing named by the spectacle has any chance of bringing any kind of contestation to bear against it. Moreover, one would have to be in the terminal phase of some nephritic Trotskyism or otherwise aspiring to some position in the joint management of human misery, to fail to acknowledge the very concept of a movement, and a fortiori of a social movement, has no other content besides the operations that they permit. A general rendering equivalent of all intentions on the basis of a generalized fidgeting quite in compliance with the ends that commodity nihilism commands. That same swarm of human beings with a pretense to critique gets labeled as a movement must in the future be considered as an irrefutable proof of its innocuousness. That is, in the present configuration of hostilities, as a manifestation of an intimate connivance with domination. There will certainly be no lack of fidgeters to object to the fact that we aren't dealing here with any particular movement, but with the unemployed persons movement, a strictly determined object, and to put it another way, an empirical one. But the unfortunate thing, in this instance, is that the concept of unemployed worker is just as stripped of all meaning as a concept of movement, in that their coupling, in the absence of some miracle or another, is hardly gifted with many genesic virtues. Whoever consents to take the slightest glance can easily see that the concept of unemployed worker doesn't express any real attribute in particular, but on the contrary, the absence of an attribute, the fact of not working, that it specifies nothing positive at least, nothing existent. An individual can only be labeled as not working within a society where to work, that is, to enter into a certain type of domination relations, is a norm. The concept of unemployed worker, thus, has in the last resort nothing to do with any tangible, isolable reality. It just expresses the obligation to work, and the fact that this obligation, in commodity society, is operative on the individual level. The innocent little maneuver, with a lack of a given quality, transforms into being itself a particular quality, and non-belonging to a category becomes a distinct category of its own, has in fact nothing neutral about it at all. It is precisely that which gives a foundation to the whole exorbitant power of constraint in the world of the authoritarian commodity. Santa Claus indignantly insists the unemployed persons movement is garbage. Quote, more profoundly, here at the end of 1998, the opinion that for the most part went through a revival this year has shown itself to be less receptive, and has not let itself be distracted from the preparation of its festive events. Furthermore, the novelty effect that the media are generally so fond of, which the unemployed persons movement benefited from in 1997, has gone flat. The welfare occupations have appeared to have so totally gotten a makeover that the government has taken great care this year to not let these kinds of actions come about. End quote, from Le Monde, December 31st, 1998. Even in the context of an accelerated disintegration of the classical wage system, the notion of unemployed person remains doubtless a war machine of the highest caliber in domination's arsenal. However, there its use is flipped upside down. From being a weapon of attack, it has now gone into use as a defensive apparatus. It now serves to pervert the eruption into commodity publicity of the alarming inflation of its negation. Bloom. For the time being, the crisis of labor, which at a certain point managed, as an ethos, to substitute itself for all singular ethos, must be understood as a crisis of domination, which only imperfectly controls, with its present means, what subsists outside of labor, that is, outside of its influence over appearances. The jobless person, the precarious worker, the thisless people, the thatless people, are just so many masks that the spectacle imposes on the Bloom when they try to openly force open the doors of publicity. The excluded thus can be included, precisely as excluded, but the growing haste and tactlessness with which people ban the bare mankind as human beings, from access to an acknowledged existence, indicate with certainty that there is a crack in the very heart of social appearances. Certainly, the ordinary recipe for preserving the regime of separation, which consists in socializing metaphysics, and making what it is in fact the truth for everyone appear as if it were just a particular fraction of the population, still provides significant service, but to be duped by that requires a faculty of illusion that our contemporaries appear to be less and less capable of. And so, with the exception of an inexorable handful of assholes, the feeling that we're inhabiting our own lives like sparrows in the Montparnasse train station as exiles has tended to spread among all mankind. This is what the forces of concealment have a heavy interest in hiding behind some harmless and noisy unemployed persons movement. A new race of assholes, the managers of misery. Quote, there were more than 30,000 of us at the demonstration this morning. I don't want to shine your shoes or nothing, but I really find you quite extraordinary. I'm proud of you, proud to be in charge of the Poor People's Union. End quote, by Charles Houreaux, leader of the CGT Unemployed Persons Committees, and Bouche de Rhône, quoted by Liberation, December 4th, 1998. If the unemployed persons movement were, in spite of all, related to any reality at all, it certainly wouldn't resemble in any way what people would like to understand by that, an adventure in contestation. Because before assuming its autonomy as a spectacular creature, the latter had to be born from one as a surprise event within domination. That is, in less oracular terms, of a conflict of interests. And as a conflict of interest between union putrefactions having to do with the management and monopolizing the gigantic masses of money that circulate around the welfare allocations and their distribution. As for their unexpected duration, it must be imputed to another kind of competition, this time between the classic decomposing unionism, although it suffices to merely glance a bit at the methods of the CGT Unemployed, or SUD, to remember that, in effect, quote, in history as in nature, decomposition is the laboratory of life, end quote from Marx, and the young emerging bureaucracies of associations like AC, Droit Devant, DAL, etc., who've popped up with a highly suspicious spontaneity to cauterize one by one all the new wounds of the social disaster, are licensed specialists, demanding in exchange a few crumbs and a little recognition. And all this hullabaloo, all this merry mess, there's not even a shadow of any contradiction. And above all, in the rotting role played that opposed the boss's government regarding the 35-hour work week, an obvious plagiarism of the most burlesque exploits of the Comité des Forges in the 1920s. And so if the unemployed persons movement was anything at all, it was but that, and nothing else. For those who know the kind of fanaticism that our contemporaries so enjoy putting into their submission, there is no doubt that domination can afford to have a movement like that every winter, and maybe even a few at a time. However, something did happen on the margins of this ever so artistically mastered orchestration, which even went beyond it at many points. It was something that didn't start with the unemployed persons movement and didn't end with it. Something that can't be named, and that all the critical metaphysicians participated in one way or another. Lasting a number of weeks, assemblies gathered in the Jesu amphitheaters that could only be defined by their suspensory refusal to define themselves, or more probably, the impossibility of their doing so. There is no room here to say more. It will suffice for the reader to know that neither patient discussions nor actions carried out in common, nor even the shared hostility towards the society were enough to overcome the separation. The first consequence of this was the assembly's powerlessness to delimit themselves, but above all, and this is a more serious problem, to designate their enemy. It goes without saying that external circumstances in the isolation of the assembly were not uninvolved in this, as was our failure to make ourselves understood. Since then, the problem of constituting a collective subject has remained the only question that we have deserved in any way to be measured by. Transcending Bloom, such is a task. All critical metaphysics tends toward this exclusive goal, and it is in that light alone that we may be read, in all honesty. Our perspective is purely practical. Nothing in the world besides a spectacle paralysis into which 30 years of emaciated thinking have ended up leading critical activity could explain the need and reason behind our theoretical investigations. The question of community, which from now on poses itself as the stakes of the free creation of an autonomous common, is the only issue that can bring us out of nihilism through social contestation. And as long as it speaks the language of domination, as long as it doesn't put itself explicitly on the metaphysical terrain, it will hardly deserve more than the mere curiosity that one might legitimately feel when faced with this universal form of fascination with lost causes. We have to start from the historical preemption of the totality of commodity categories and of the world they build. Quote, "It is not an indifferent matter whether we forget metaphysical concepts or obstinately prolong their use without examining them." End quote from Heidegger. A text entitled Fragments of a Theoretical Discourse, to appear in Tiqqun number 2, will be dedicated to just a clarification of the strategic function of the metaphysical categories in force in the management and organization of social misery. And so, for the concept of work, for example, which is no longer anything more than an empty form susceptible to indifferently containing any kind of manifestation at all in its definitive abstraction, and thus appropriate to none, the proof being that the Negrius can even include it in the breastfeeding of newborns by their mothers. They then poetically talk about producing infants without even having needed to read Swift, and that people can knock themselves out trying to replace it with employment, or even employability. Since the element of self-production that participation in social functioning was once able to contain has totally evaporated, work appears at last for what it really is: a contingent, limited, and confusional mode of disclosure, a fallacious qualification for pure servitude. If the affirmation that there is no more work has any meaning, it's not because it's becoming harder and harder to get yourself exploited, but because now there's nothing left but jobless negativity and negativity-less jobs. From this point of view, any contestation that already considers itself sufficiently radical to be able to limit itself to critique of work, which regardless domination is already domesticated by and large, is falling behind the new mutations of capitalism. We have to take as our point of departure, and it is on this level we consider ourselves to have a chance of confronting the enemy, that work does not exist outside the system of domination's representations. That is, another mode of reality disclosure, true community, needs to be invented through war. It's not about exterminating the dominations or espousing the cause of the dominated from the lofty heights of the sociology chair at the College of France, but of destroying a world where certain blooms exist as a dominators and others, the majority, as a dominated. For the rest, we can just let the slaves, whether of Trotskyist, Negriist, or Bordeauxian obedience, go on disputing the straw men of their servitude. The defeat of what we took part in designates negatively a task to be accomplished. Only those who understand it as such can inherit this infinite debt. To the attention of those who don't think themselves free of the duty to carry into the future the tradition of the oppressed, we hereby reproduce 2 texts that were distributed during this short campaign of agitation: Marginal Considerations in the Present Movement and The Jobless Speak. The first, distributed in the second week of our practical engagement, exposed an analysis that nothing that has come afterwards has yet contradicted. One of our weaknesses is that we believe that in spite of formulations, which in places are naive and have since been surpassed by us, it sketches out a position which, at all points, remains ours. The second was distributed to the employees of the INSEE on Friday the 13th of March by 40 of our comrades, invited there for a luncheon. Its interest lies in the fact that it constitutes the remaining traces of a direct attack on those that manufacture the form of appearance of the alienated social totality. We have, as an indication of how hardly susceptible to the procedure they were, the fact that we were called Laponist Pol Pots by the big despot around there because of its content. It goes without saying that the faculties that we engaged in this war only grew greater as a result of their expenditure. The history of our detrimental effects has only just started, and we'd like to be able to swear, like Unemployed, that, quote, "From now on, there will be no more oaths mumbled on the street corners by shivering, starving people as you pass by. There will be no more demands or bitter recriminations. All that is over. We're going totally silent. You can keep your money, bread, wine, trees, and flowers. You can keep all the joys of life and your unalterable serenity of conscience. We won't demand anything anymore. We don't want any of the things you've desired and demanded in vain for so many centuries anymore. Our complete desperation will from now on carry out, against ourselves, the definitive ban you've placed on our enjoyment of them. But be warned, we are keeping up the fire, and we beg you not to be too surprised at the coming fracas. Your palaces and hotels will burn quite nicely when one day we decide to set them ablaze. because we've listened very attentively to the lessons your chemistry professors give, and we've invented a few little contraptions of our own that will amaze you. End quote from the hopeless one. Marginal considerations on the present movement. These few remarks have been primitively jotted down in haste as personal reflections on a bad record. A comrade thought they might be useful to the movement, so I've transcribed them in identical haste, which should excuse their imperfections. They should be thought of as disorderly suggestions read over a stranger's shoulder. 1. It's rare to have a movement that's popular in proportion to its radicalness, which is true of ours. The sympathy that it gets provisionally comes from the fact that in a society without community, each person's identity is exclusively determined by their function in the production process, by their work. It follows that outside of that work, which is the whole of the social existence of the man of our times, he is but a being without identity. Classless, anonymous, just any old singularity, unwaged. As such, the bum is the hidden truth behind all workers when they're not at work, a figure of their existence as a free individual. But the scandal of an empty freedom, a freedom without content, figures into that as well. The bum's freedom is a freedom to do nothing, since as an individual, all the means of production are refused to him or her. Thus, it is around the unwaged, the bum, that the primary contradiction of the present social organization is woven. Its maintenance requires, as part of the same movement, each person's exclusion from mastery over his or her own activity, participation in his own life, and the total mobilization of his energy in the form of work. For that mobilization, a kind of miracle has to take place where each person is simultaneously at peak enthusiasm and peak passivity. The bum is dangerous to the extent that he seeks to give content to his freedom, and power has understood that. If power is trembling now, it is because it knows that the networks of the unwaged are not only universal, but above all radical. Not a protest against any particular injustice, but against the pure and simple injustice of their having been marginalized in life. And the particular liberation of each of them is the liberation of all. 2. There's little doubt that the dominant language presupposes a dominant order, so it can't be adequately contested while the petty, bickering opposition between waged work and joblessness. Upon reflection, it quickly becomes clear that the function of an opposition like that is to hide the essentially passive nature of wage work and the truly active nature of the unwaged or the welfare recipient, busy with their own freedom. And so, the real choice here isn't between wage labor and joblessness, but rather between free activity and alienated activity, which is just a kind of agitated passivity. Though it isn't wrong of the movement to go on advancing, disguised with the name movement of the unwaged and precarious, which is the only way that the present order can understand and thus falsify it, it should certainly not hide its own radicalness from itself. Its true aim is the suppression of work as alienated activity. 3. We're lucky that we have the benefit of exceptional historical circumstances. Never perhaps has there been a society as hated as this one. The excessive nature of the present social crisis can be grasped positively as a gigantic individual and collective act of sabotage. There is not a housewife left that hasn't entertained the idea that a complete overturning of the present social organization is necessary. It's up to us to make the most obvious contradiction of the society burst, which is that it shows itself to be detestable, absurd, and irreparable, while simultaneously claiming that it's eternal. The present social situation is a, quote, violent state that cannot last, because our fellow citizens are far too disunited to preserve the ancient form of the republic much longer, end quote. In many minds, the thought creeps up that there's no more time for secretly deploring our miseries, but that we must risk everything to free ourselves from them, that since the illness is a violent one, the remedy must be as well. We are many, we who silently curse the social order, which we must either be the slaves or enemies of. It's already clear that our movement is an unheard-of crystallization agent, that it is beginning a chaotic process, the result of which will hinge on the slightest differences in its initial conditions. We will either have an entirely liberated society or an even more totalitarian regime. 4. It is up to us to realize the hatred that the society devotes to itself and make it conscious of the object of that hatred, commodity relations, which have devastated everything that was once human about our society. Our movement's function could be to constitute a plateau, a platform for the articulation of all the partial struggles in which we've managed to recognize the universal content of the struggle against the commodity. As pathetic as it may appear, the fight against genetically modified corn, resisting the continued degradation of the most elementary conditions of existence, or the search for alternatives to commodity relations that are awkwardly being sketched out in the local exchange systems, SEL, both have plenty to do with our movement. 5. Our movement's essential contradiction counterposes the party of partial demands, represented by the associations of the unemployed, and the party of disruption, which so freely express itself in the General Assemblies at Jussot. Insofar as they are comprised of reformist and bureaucratic organizations, the unemployed workers' associations have corporatist, categorical, separate interests, and cannot truly desire an effective end to joblessness because it would mean they would have to come to an end. Their only objective is to eternally wage a fight without victory, and with absurd content. They have anything but an interest in expanding the movement, which would then escape their control. Their collusion with the spectacular order and its sad soliloquy, ever full of reason, is proven by the nature of their so-called spectacular or symbolic actions. Because they remain within the sphere register of representation, they make themselves the necessary allies of the spectacle, and speak its language of numbers and despicable acts. Thus, when they end up wanting to loot a supermarket, they only do so virtually. They work in such a way as to make the mass of the people that they organize continue going to the cash register, rather than just going in and consuming right there in the shop, sharing with other customers. Then they negotiate with the managers to try to get the right to take out of the shopping carts what their henchmen have filled, without having to pay. In so doing, they only work to confirm the sovereignty of power and property by giving it a chance to make an exception to a new kind of privileged ones. They merely ask the right to infringe upon rights. Anyway, it's only natural that they speak the language of separation, blind as they are to the political aspects of economics. They can't understand the obvious fact that work now presents itself as a simple process of the maintenance of order by occupying the energies, attention of the greatest possible number of persons. No more than they can see that it is the police forces that in the final analysis provide the foundations for private property. Thus, they only express themselves either in the jargon of specialized politics or in the jargon of economy, but never in the language of real life, which is the common attribute of reappropriated life, of autonomous existence. It should be remarked, finally, that they are not invulnerable, far from it, indeed, because in their internal functioning, as in that of the society as a whole, the management is autonomous of the base, which is quite often more radical than its own spectacular bureaucracy. We can base ourselves on and draw an advantage from this weakness, there as elsewhere. 6. A global movement of social contestation has at least one dimension insusceptible to recuperation: the new and real lifestyles it experiences in practice. Its explosive power depends on the extent to which it attains to making felt the planetary distance that separates the possible from the real, through its own partial realizations. It is by making the movement of disruption and upheaval passionate that its aims can be made desirable. At such a point of social devastation and desertification as commodity society has brought us to, it's not just love that needs to be reinvented, but the whole of human relationships. Our success will mostly depend on our ability to give a living example of a free and authentic sociality. Real life is not mere vain words, nor a poet's chimera. It is so far from being such a thing that one single day of riding suffices to render death preferable to an alienated everyday life. The experience of such a brutal transfiguration of consciousness is one of those rare things that can bring on a mass desertion from wage society. It's not with any kind of repugnant commiseration that we will win over the other sectors of the population to our cause, but by making them discover their own misery. The disappearance of the masters has not abolished slavery. It has generalized it. It is no longer a question of fighting against the fictitious management and administration of the society, but of self-organizing our lives with scorn for the survival of a power structure that is only a police existence. The spectacle colonizes the future. We must take over and occupy the present. 7. It appears that one of the most urgent problems that our movement has to deal with is how to get out of the ghetto of corporatist demands regarding joblessness, and how to find that exponential tipping point of unrest, which will rally the other categories of the population to our side, of achieving a suspension in the tyrannical tempo of production. Such an effect was in part produced in 68. The difference between the present context and that of 68 has to do with the fact that because the absurdity of the society is today concretely shown, it can be concretely resolved. The 60s had the means to give themselves a revolution without consequence, but we don't. By appealing in the form of written contracts for the constitution of action committees, tracts which will describe what an action committee is, how it can function, etc., the movement's progress saw them flourishing in a celebratory proliferation that alone was able to save the general strike from passivity. But the bureaucratic leftist organizations, which at the time had so much power, managed to infiltrate them as was to be expected. The present non-existence of such parties allows one to speculate that they would not suffer the same fate today. We then saw the reversing effect of these little groups of a few dozen persons, who carried out their decisions the very second they were adopted. It wasn't just action that liberated them anyway, but also speech, insofar as it is only to the extent that men have something to do together that they have something to say. The call to self-organization that concludes our communique to the headquarters of the Socialist Party only makes sense if we give this abstract formulation effective lived content. That still remains to be done. 8. The strategy adopted by the spectacle to defeat us is quite clear. It's totally unoriginal. The regime's news organizations, in this first stage, last week sang a funeral hymn for our movement. Then, faced with the relative failure of this maneuver, they resolved to criminalize those who they had not managed to discourage. Finally, the unemployed workers' associations, in their sad struggle for recognition, could easily have undertaken a prudent little war of harassment while waiting for Tuesday's demonstrations, when the CGT and the various allies of the present order had their dreamed of opportunity to make social contestation into a pretty little funeral procession. Though this movement must soon be defeated, according to their plans, it will only be because it trembled in light of its own radicalness, and because it didn't grasp the universal content of its goal, the abolition of commodity relations, which should have allowed it to gather together, in unity within it, all the isolated and fragmentary struggles aiming towards said goal. It could also be that it wasn't able to organize its diffusion and communications with the use of its own means. But the last word has still not been said in that respect. Though this whole undertaking is doomed to end in disaster, it will succeed in provisionally shattering the separation of men of goodwill. The domination has good reason to be disturbed by this, since it's just as dangerous for it as the gathering of a few beings determined to destroy it is. Since in normal times it has reason to congratulate itself for its effectiveness in preventing encounters that might be dangerous to it. On this point at least, we've beaten them. Quote, "You're only equal to anyone else if you can prove it. You only deserve freedom if you can conquer it." End quote from Baudelaire, Knock Down the Poor. Paris, Monday, January 26, 1998. The jobless speak. If anything should be more surprising than our presence here today at the INSEE, it might be the fact that we didn't think to pay you a visit sooner. Motives aren't lacking. The commendable and well-known effort to falsify unemployment figures that the NC makes such sacrifices for so consistently already gave all of us quite the occasion to come here, all those for whom the adjusted lie of seasonal variations is a profession come clean then and there. We cannot let slide the insolence of such specialists, who talk about us without knowing us, and who, hiding in the corners of their fine offices, are so afraid to meet us. Well then, fine, you see, we've taken the first step ourselves. But the obviousness of this primary motive might make it appear somewhat superficial. The second and more profound motive has to do with the very principle behind statistics and surveys. They're one of the most powerful instruments of domination and social control in use today. If the master of a society is he who holds control over the representations that it makes for itself, then the NC is the most zealous and efficient of servants in the hands of power. It is the NC, in effect, that pulls out of its ass the false self-consciousness that this society gives itself, and then spreads it all over the whole pages of journalistic shitheadery. It does so in accord with interests that are plain to see. They're the ones who fill up the empty concepts with numbers, thus forcing assent to the ignominy of the commodity society whose language it never ceased to speak. But they are above all the active symbol of the murderous quantification of life that is at work everywhere. The encrypted language of modern domination contains all the impudent arbitrariness of those who, acting behind closed doors, think there's no one they can't figure into their accounts. Polling opportunely takes the place of any real debate. The limitless horror of exclusion always appears ever so very moderate in the columns of numbers, and the truth can always be silenced with surveys. All you have to know how to do is put the question the wrong way. But today, we've come to meet the men of INSEE in person. If we can't expect anything at all from this institution, which ought by all rights to be destroyed, it's not the same for those that comprise it. They are capable of some consciousness, at least. They can recognize the social function that they are made to fill, which makes them the sad manservants of oppression. They can still recognize their statisticians' misery in their desolate offices, at the ends of hospital-looking corridors, where they waste their lives in the mute company of white noise, vectorial spaces, loose averages, and deviation types, doing joyless, useless work. And having seen it clearly, they'll have to acknowledge the truth that they become parasites, weakened men, their own executioners. And so then perhaps they will come to share with us the disgust they inspire in us, both them and the world that they relentlessly build. Perhaps they might even join us, and they'll be welcome bag and baggage.